She was just a maid, nameless, no past. No one paid attention to her. But that night, when she entered the ballroom under the crystal chandeliers, 20 of America's most dangerous mafia bosses held their breath because they had seen that face before. 15 years ago, in fire, in blood, on the night they all thought they were going to die. And the man in the corner, the man whose name struck fear into all of Chicago, almost dropped his glass of wine. If you're watching this video, please like and comment with the city you're watching in, so I know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The rain came in sideways that night, hammering the tall windows of Black Marrow Estate like it had a personal grievance with the glass. Inside, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a decade, Maria Vale was on her hands and knees scrubbing a wine stain out of white Carrara marble while guests in silk and diamonds laughed somewhere above her head. She worked fast. She always worked fast. Fast meant invisible. Invisible meant safe. The stain was a deep burgundy. Someone had knocked over a bottle of 1987 Bordeaux during the setup, and Mrs. Caro, the estate's head housekeeper, had looked at Maria the way she always looked at Maria when something went wrong, like the mess was already her fault before she'd even been handed the rag. Every corner, Mrs. Caro had said, not just the visible ones. Tonight is not a night for corners. Maria hadn't answered. She never answered. Answering drew attention, and attention drew consequences. She'd learned that at 12 years old in the third group home she'd cycled through, and the lesson had calcified somewhere deep inside her chest over the 11 years since. She was 23. She had worked for the Vespera household for 4 of those years. She knew where the fire exits were in every wing of this estate. She knew which floorboards in the east corridor creaked loudest after midnight. She knew that Marcus Vespera kept a loaded handgun in the second drawer of his study desk, and that his wife Claudine drank herself to sleep by 9:30 most evenings, and that neither of them had ever once asked Maria her last name. She was furniture. Beautiful furniture didn't talk back. The ballroom doors were still closed when she finished the floor and gathered her cleaning caddy. Through the walls she could feel the bass thrum of the orchestra warming up. Low, expensive sound, the kind that moved through your ribcage without asking permission. She had 20 minutes before the first guests arrived. She was supposed to be back in the service corridor, out of sight by then. She was halfway across the lobby when she heard the scream. Not a scream from a guest. A scream from upstairs. Sharp, cracked at the edges. The kind that happened when someone stopped performing shock and started actually feeling it. Mireia froze. Her first instinct was to move away from it, the way she always moved away from things that had nothing to do with her. Then a door slammed above her head, and she heard footsteps, heeled, frantic, on the stairs. Daniela Vespera appeared at the top of the landing. She was 21, beautiful in the architectural way that serious money produced. Sharp jaw, dark hair pinned up, wearing half of a gown that cost more than Mireia's rent for a year. But her face was wrong, chalk white. Her eyes were too wide and moving too fast, and one hand was gripping the banister with the rigid desperation of someone trying not to fall. Behind her came Cassian Vespera himself. Mireia had worked in this house for 4 years, and she could count the number of times she'd seen Cassian Vespera truly unmasked on one hand. He was 61, silver-haired, elegant in the way that certain predators were elegant, unhurried, deliberate, perfectly still until the moment he wasn't. Right now he wasn't. His face was a controlled wall, but his jaw was locked hard enough that the muscle twitched beneath his left eye, and that alone told Mireia everything she needed to know about the severity of whatever was happening. "Get downstairs," he said to Daniela, very quietly. "I can't. Papa, I can't. I told you Get downstairs, stand up, stop shaking." Daniela made a sound in her throat that wasn't quite a word. Her other hand came up, pressed flat against her collarbone, and Mireia saw it then. The slight tremor in the fingers, the too rapid blinking, the way the girl's legs were carrying her weight just a few degrees off center. Mireia had seen that look before. Not in this house, but she'd seen it. Cassian looked down from the landing, and his gaze found Mireia the way a searchlight found a wall. Without warmth, without particular hostility, just an absolute and total landing of attention that made the back of her neck prickle. "You," he said. "Come up." She went up. "Because you didn't say no to Cassian Vespera in his own house." The next 12 minutes were the most disorienting of Mireya's adult life. She stood in Daniela's bedroom, all white and gold, the size of a small apartment, while Dr. Fenwick, the family's private physician, worked over Daniela on the bed with the specific calm efficiency of a man who had handled crises for this family before and understood that his continued employment depended on his discretion. Daniela was semi-conscious. Her pulse was elevated. The pills on the nightstand were prescription, but the dosage wasn't. The Sovereign Gala was starting in 40 minutes. Cassian stood at the window with his back to the room. He didn't look at his daughter. He looked at the driveway below, where the first black cars were already beginning to arrive. "She can't attend," Dr. Fenwick said quietly. "No," Cassian agreed. "We could announce an illness." "No." Cassian's voice didn't change volume. It didn't need to. 37 representatives from 9 syndicates are arriving in the next hour. An absent host family sends a message, the wrong message. He turned from the window. His eyes found Mireya again, standing near the door with her cleaning caddy still in her hand, and something shifted in his expression. Not calculation exactly, more like recognition. The look of a man who had identified a solution he didn't particularly enjoy but intended to use regardless. "You're approximately the same height," he said. The bottom dropped out of Mireya's stomach. "No," she said. The word came out before she could stop it. Something flickered behind Cassian's eyes. Not anger, patience being deliberately exercised. "I'll double your monthly wage," he said, "for the inconvenience." "I'm not... I don't know how to..." She stopped herself. Her heart was doing something violent against the inside of her chest, and her hands had gone cold. "I'm a housekeeper. I clean floors. Tonight you attend the Sovereign Gala in my daughter's place." He said it the way someone said it's raining. Factual, finished, not up for debate. "You will stand. You will smile when smiled at. You will not speak unless spoken to, and even then you will speak as little as possible. You will leave the ballroom when I signal you, that is all. Those people will know I'm not her. Most of them have never met her. She is 19 in public record and 21 in reality and has attended exactly 2 family functions in the last decade. You will wear her gown, her jewelry, her name for 3 hours." He paused. "This is not a request, Mireya." She heard her name in his mouth and felt something cold move through her. In 4 years, she could count on one hand how many times he'd used it. She thought about the fire exits. She thought about the locked east wing, where she'd once heard shouting that stopped abruptly the way shouting only stopped when someone decided to stop it. She thought about Marcus Vespera's second desk drawer. She said nothing, which meant yes, which was the only thing she could say. The gown was ivory silk. It had a structured bodice and a skirt that moved like water, and it fit her in a way that felt obscene, like wearing someone else's skin. Mrs. Caro did the alterations in 20 minutes, quick, efficient, not making eye contact, and pinned Mireya's dark hair up in the same style the family stylist had planned for Daniela. The earrings were real diamonds. The gloves were cream satin, wrist length, and they covered her hands completely, which was the only thing Mireya was grateful for, because her hands were shaking and she couldn't make them stop. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. That was fine. She'd never been entirely sure who she was looking at in mirrors anyway. "Keep your chin level," Mrs. Caro said. "Not up, level. Up reads as arrogance. You want neutral." "What reads as terrified?" Mrs. Caro's mouth thinned. "Don't be." The ballroom of Black Marrow Estate was 2 stories of gilded plasterwork, enormous floral arrangements that smelled like hothouse roses and money, and the kind of controlled opulence that existed to make people feel they'd arrived somewhere that mattered. The orchestra was playing something Mireya didn't know the name of. Servers moved through the crowd with champagne flutes balanced on silver trays, and the air tasted of expensive perfume and tobacco and the specific electric tension of dangerous people pretending to be civilized. Mireya stood outside the ballroom doors for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was the longest she could stand there before one of Cassian's men, a broad-shouldered figure in a black tuxedo with no expression, placed his hand briefly at her elbow, not roughly, and said simply, It's time. She walked through the doors. The reaction was not what she expected. She expected to be ignored. She was very good at being ignored. She had spent her entire adult life cultivating invisibility the way other people cultivated skills. Instead, the room changed. It wasn't instant. It moved like a wave from the cluster of men nearest the doors outward through the room in rolling increments. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. And the faces that turned toward her, weathered faces, scarred faces, faces shaped by decades of real violence and real consequence, showed something that made no sense at all. Shock. Not the social shock of someone making a scene, something deeper, something that lived in the body, in the way a man's posture changes when he sees something he was certain was gone from the world. A heavy-set man near the champagne table went completely still. His glass paused halfway to his mouth. He was staring at Mireia with an expression she couldn't name. Not desire, not recognition in any ordinary sense, but something raw, something closer to grief with a question in it. Two men to her left actually stepped back. Mireia kept walking. Her heels were too high and the marble floor was treacherous, and her lungs were doing something tight and insufficient with the available air. But she kept walking because stopping would be worse. She fixed her eyes on the far wall and walked and told herself this was nothing. This was a misunderstanding. These people were confused about something that had nothing to do with her. A hand caught her arm, firm but not rough. She turned. The man holding her arm was perhaps 65, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had been broken and rebuilt at least twice. His suit was perfect. His eyes were something else entirely, but dark, very still, and looking at her with an intensity that pressed against her skin from 6 inches away. "My God," he said, barely above a murmur. "You look exactly like her." "I'm sorry." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." "The scar," he said. His eyes had gone to her neck, to the spot just below and behind her right ear where the small crescent-shaped mark had lived on her skin since before she could remember. She'd always assumed it was a burn. She'd never given it much thought. "Behind your ear, you have the same scar." "Let go of my arm," she said quietly. He did, immediately, which surprised her. Men who grabbed women's arms at parties did not usually let go that quickly. "Forgive me." He stepped back. His eyes hadn't left her face. "My name is Aldrich Soren. I represent the Morn Syndicate out of New Orleans." He said it like she should know it. 15 years ago, a young girl pulled 3 of my best men out of a burning warehouse in the south side of Chicago. She couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. She knew the building well enough to lead them out through a drainage tunnel when every other exit was compromised. He paused. "I never learned her name. I looked for years. She disappeared like smoke." Mireia's chest had gone very still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No," he said, studying her. "I don't imagine you do." She excused herself. She moved through the crowd toward the drink stations, keeping her breathing even, keeping her chin level, not up level, and told herself repeatedly that whatever that man thought he recognized, he was wrong. She was Mireia Vale. She had grown up in foster care and group homes across 3 states. She cleaned floors and changed linens and knew how to disappear into rooms, and she had never been in any burning building in Chicago. She had never been to Chicago at all. 2 more people approached her before she reached the drink table. One, a lean, silver-eyed woman in her 50s representing some West Coast family whose name Mireia didn't catch, touched her own throat involuntarily when she looked at Mireia, like she was swallowing something down. The other was a younger man, mid-30s, who stood very close and said something in a lowered voice about the night of the Halcourt massacre, and a girl in white running the fence line, before Mireia stepped back and told him he had the wrong person. She was shaking. Her hands were invisible beneath the satin gloves, but the rest of her wasn't, and she could feel herself losing control of her composure by fractions, the way a wall developed cracks before it failed entirely. She needed 3 minutes alone. She needed to stand in a small dark room and breathe until her heartbeat dropped to something manageable. She took a champagne flute off a passing tray and didn't drink it and turned toward the east edge of the ballroom where the crowd thinned near a set of tall curtained windows. That's when she saw him. He was standing near the far pillar, slightly separate from the group of men around him, in the way that certain people were separate from groups even when standing inside them. Not by physical distance, but by the quality of their stillness. Tall, black suit, no tie, collar button open at the throat, dark hair going gray at the temples in a way that didn't soften anything about his face. He looked like he'd been assembled for the specific purpose of being difficult to look away from and more difficult to read. He was holding a whiskey glass. Or he had been holding it, because at the exact moment that Mireya's gaze found his across the ballroom floor, the glass dropped 3 inches in his hand, just 3, before he caught it. And the composed architecture of his face did something complicated and involuntary that she didn't know how to interpret. He wasn't shocked the way the others had been shocked. He was shocked the way someone was shocked when they found a thing they had genuinely stopped believing still existed. His eyes didn't leave her. She couldn't look away from him, which she hated, because the inability to look away from people was something she usually reserved for threats. Someone at her elbow said, "That's Lucian Dragor." She looked sideways. A server, young, passing with a tray. He didn't seem to realize he'd spoken aloud until she looked at him, and then he dropped his eyes and moved on. She looked back at the pillar. Lucian Dragor. She didn't know how she knew the name, but she did. The way you knew the names of weather systems and fault lines, not because you'd studied them, but because they were the kind of thing that left marks on the world around them, and you learned the name through the marks. Chicago. He ran Chicago. He ran most of the Midwest corridor through a network of shell companies and private port contracts, and some arrangement with 3 distinct federal agencies that no one had ever been able to fully document. He was 42 or 43. He had been implicated in 11 federal investigations over the last 2 decades, and walked out of every single one. He was walking toward her. Not fast, not cutting through the crowd, just moving through it with the specific lack of urgency that meant he was coming and he knew she wasn't going anywhere, and there was no reason to rush. The crowd accommodated him without being asked. That said something. Mireya considered her options. She could move toward the eastern windows. She could signal for Cassian Vespera, though the thought of owing Cassian anything further tonight sat in her gut like something rotten. She could stand still and hold her champagne flute and wait. She stood still. Her legs weren't entirely steady, but she locked her knees and stood still. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Cedar and something underneath it that wasn't sweet, wasn't sharp, just old and contained like wood smoke from a fire that had burned down to coals. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, which should have felt aggressive and instead felt like something worse, like he was being careful with something that could break. "You're not Daniela Vespera," he said. Not a question. "No," she said, because there was no point denying it to this man. "Where'd they find you?" "I work here." His jaw tightened slightly. Something moved in his eyes that she couldn't place. Anger, but directed inward. At himself or at a situation, not at her. "For how long?" 4 years. He said nothing for a moment. His gaze moved briefly to the spot behind her ear. Just briefly, a fraction of a second, then back to her face. "What's your name?" "Mireya Vale." Before that, the bottom of her stomach dropped out for the second time that evening. "That's my name." "Mireya." He said it like he was setting it down somewhere, careful, temporary. "How much do you know about why you're standing in this room right now?" "I was told to." "And before that, how much do you know about yourself?" Something in her chest went tight and airless. "Enough." He shook his head, not disagreeing, just, "No." He said it quietly. "You don't. And I need you to understand something right now before this night gets significantly worse than it already is." He shifted half a degree, angling his body between her and the larger room in a way she suspected was deliberate. "The people in this room who are staring at you, half of them are staring because they think you saved their lives. The other half are staring because they want to make sure you don't remember enough to end theirs." The orchestra played something with strings. Somewhere a woman laughed too loudly. "I don't know what you mean," Mireya said. "I know you don't." His voice was very low now, meant only for her. "That's the only reason you're still alive." She looked at him. really looked, the way she almost never looked at people, directly, taking in his face and the tension in the lines around his eyes and the way his hand had gone slightly tight around the whiskey glass again. "You've been looking for me," she said. She didn't know where the words came from. They arrived fully formed, like something rising to a surface. His expression changed in a way that was almost unbearable, just for a second. Then it locked back down. 15 years, he said. The lights went out. Not all of them, just the main chandeliers plunging the ballroom into the dim gold of emergency fixtures. Then the first gunshot cracked through the ceiling from somewhere above, and the screaming started. She had known, somewhere in the older part of her brain, that the night was going to break open. She'd known it the way animals knew weather, through the pressure in the air, through the silence that had gathered in corners during the last hour like something coiling. But knowing it was possible didn't make the sound of a second shot shattering the nearest chandelier any less physical. She felt the percussion in her teeth, felt the hot spray of glass across her shoulder, heard the heavy crystalline crash of it hitting the marble 3 feet away. Lucien's hand closed around her arm. "Move," he said. She moved, because right now he was the only thing in this room that made any sense at all. The ballroom collapsed into chaos the way expensive things always did. Dramatically, completely, with an almost aesthetic intensity. A group of men near the bar produced weapons she hadn't known were present, and the servers, some of the servers, dropped their trays and reached inside their jackets for things that were not napkins. The orchestra scattered, leaving instruments abandoned on the stage like the aftermath of something. Lucien moved her toward the south wall, body between her and the room, not shielding her exactly, but keeping her in his peripheral vision, while his other hand moved to his side, to something holstered there that she'd had no idea was present. Another shot, closer. Someone near the champagne table went down. The east doors exploded inward. Not literally exploded. Someone had hit them hard from the outside, shoulder first, and they had swung open with enough force to damage the frame. And through them came 4 men in tactical black moving fast and efficient, weapons raised, scanning. "Service corridor," Lucien said against her ear. "Behind the stage, there's a door. We go now." "I don't—" "Now, Mireia." She went, because there was nothing else. They moved through the edges of the chaos at a controlled pace. Not running, which drew fire, but not slow either. Lucien navigated around a cluster of overturned chairs, stepped past a man who was applying pressure to another man's shoulder with professional competence, pulled Mireia sideways as a server she recognized from earlier in the evening dropped his tray with a crash and reached for something at his belt. The service door was where he said it would be. He hit it with his shoulder and it opened into a narrow concrete corridor lit by fluorescent strips, smelling of cleaning solution and old paper. Behind them, the ballroom was fully burning open now. She could hear it, the specific uncontrolled sound of violence that had outgrown any attempt at direction. Lucien let go of her arm. He turned and looked at her in the flat fluorescent light, and she could see him more clearly here. The tension in his face, the steady pulse in his jaw, the eyes that were older than the rest of him somehow. "You need to tell me something," he said. "I don't know anything," she said. "I've told everyone I don't know anything. I'm a housekeeper. I clean—" "Floors, yes." Something moved across his face. "That's not what I'm asking." He paused. "The fire. When you were young. Do you remember any of it?" The word fire hit her in the sternum like something physical. She had dreamed about fire her entire life. Not as a nightmare exactly. It had never frightened her in dreams the way it did in waking. In dreams, the fire was always warm. The fire was always something she moved through rather than away from. And there were always voices inside it. And sometimes, barely, the shape of a hand. She looked at Lucien Dragor in the corridor, and something shifted behind her eyes without her permission. "I remember warmth," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, far away. "I don't— There's nothing coherent, just fragments." "A ledger," he said quietly. "Do you remember a ledger?" The word landed somewhere deep, somewhere that had been sealed for a very long time. "Tell me who you are," she said. "Not the social question, the real one. Tell me what this is. All of it. Right now." He looked at her for a long moment. Above them, in the burning ballroom, someone was shouting in a voice she recognized as Cassian Vespera's. "There's a room below this estate," Lucien said. "A vault. I've known about it for years. What's inside it concerns you more than it concerns anyone else in this building." He paused. "Will you come with me?" She thought about the scar behind her ear that a man she'd never met had recognized across a ballroom. She thought about the look on Lucien Dragor's face when he'd first seen her, the whiskey glass dropping those 3 inches, that involuntary fracture in his composure. 15 years, he had said. She was 23. 15 years ago, she had been 8. The numbers sat in her chest like stones. "Yes," she said, and below them, somewhere in the sealed dark beneath the estate, something waited that had waited 15 years already and could survive another few minutes. The corridor lights flickered once, then steadied. Lucien moved toward the far end, toward a door she hadn't noticed, and Mireia followed him down into the dark, leaving behind the burning ballroom, the screaming, the shattered chandeliers, and the name Daniela Vespera, which had never been hers anyway. What waited below was something older, something that had shaped her entire life without ever introducing itself. She was about to meet it. The staircase went down farther than it had any right to. Mireia counted the steps without meaning to. An old habit from group homes, from learning buildings the way other children learned playgrounds, by mapping them in her body before she trusted them with her weight. 31 steps. The walls shifted from plastered drywall to raw concrete somewhere around the 15th, and the temperature dropped with each level, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with depth. By the time they reached the bottom, her bare arms had gone to gooseflesh beneath the ivory silk, and she could see the faint mist of her own breath in the beam of Lucien's flashlight. "How do you know this is here?" she said. Not a question exactly. More like thinking aloud. "I've had eyes on this estate for 6 years. He moved the flashlight along the far wall, searching for something. Cassian had this level poured in 2003 under permits filed as drainage infrastructure. The city inspector who signed off on it retired to Barbados the following year. He found what he was looking for: a steel door set flush into the concrete, no visible handle, a numeric keypad mounted at shoulder height. The architect who designed it died in a car accident in 2004. "Convenient," Mireia said. "Yes." Lucien crouched in front of the keypad. "Everything Cassian touches is convenient." Above them, the estate was still coming apart. She could hear it even here, muffled through 30 feet of concrete and soil, the percussion of it moving through the walls like a second heartbeat. She stood with her back to the staircase and watched Lucien work. His hands were steady. That bothered her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Not that she wanted him rattled, but steadiness like that in a situation like this didn't come from calm. It came from practice. From having been in rooms this bad before, enough times that the body stopped registering it as exceptional. "You're not surprised," she said, "by any of this. I've been planning for this night for a long time." "Planning for what, specifically?" He glanced back at her. His face in the flashlight beam was all shadow and hard angles. "For the night someone finally made a move on Cassian Vespera, and I could be in the right position when it happened." He turned back to the keypad. "I didn't plan for you to be in this building. That makes 2 of us." A soft click. The steel door disengaged from its frame with the sound of pressure equalizing. A small exhalation of sealed air, stale and metallic, pushing out from whatever had been locked inside. Lucien pulled it open. Beyond it was darkness, and then his flashlight found the room. It was smaller than she'd expected. Maybe 12 by 15 feet, the walls lined floor to ceiling with steel shelving units loaded with accordion files, cardboard document boxes, and black binders coated with alphanumeric labels she couldn't immediately parse. In the center of the room sat a steel table, bolted to the floor, and on the wall opposite the door was a second safe. This one a combination lock, heavier, older. The paint on the dial worn smooth from years of use. Mireia stepped inside. The air tasted of old paper and machine oil. She moved to the nearest shelf and pulled a binder at random. Inside were financial documents, transfer records, account numbers, names she didn't recognize attached to figures that made her stomach tighten. She put it back and pulled another. Surveillance photographs. Men she didn't know outside buildings she didn't recognize. Dates stamped in the bottom corner, going back to 1987. This is years of records, she said. Decades. Lucien was at the combination safe, working the dial with the particular patience of someone who had done this before or had the combination memorized. Cassian has been collecting leverage on every major player in the American underworld since before most of them were powerful enough to be worth collecting it on. Insurance, blackmail, containment, call it whatever you want. This is how he stayed untouchable. He paused on the dial. It's also how I knew you existed. She turned from the shelves. What? There's a file in there with your name on it. Your real name. He said it like he was setting a charge and stepping back. I found a reference to it 2 years ago in documents I acquired through a source inside the estate. A file labeled Arden S., cross-reference to the Halcourt incident and the warehouse fire of October 2009. He looked at her. That's when I knew you were still alive. The room was very quiet. Mireia stood with a binder in her hands and felt the cold air on her arms and listened to her own heartbeat doing something irregular and insistent. My name is Mireia Vale, she said. The words sounded hollow. Your name is Seraphine Arden, he said. Not unkindly, but not softly either. Just factually, the way you told someone their house was burning, with the understanding that kindness was a luxury the situation couldn't afford. Your father was Elias Arden. He worked as an independent forensic accountant contracted by 3 separate federal task forces between 2004 and 2009. He was using that access to build a private evidence archive against every major syndicate operating in the Midwest corridor. Lucien's hand stopped on the dial. In October 2009, someone told Cassian Vespera what Elias Arden was doing. Cassian ordered the Halcourt warehouse fire. Your father was inside. Mireia put the binder back on the shelf. Her hands were careful about it. She was very careful about it. You said he was murdered, she said. He was. And I was there. You were 8 years old and you got out through the drainage access on the south wall. You spent the next several months moving through the city on your own during the worst violence this country's organized crime networks had seen in 30 years. You helped people without understanding who they were. You disappeared before anyone could find out your name. He paused. And then the state found you and put you in the system, and you became Mireia Vale and stayed that way. She was aware of the pressure behind her eyes. Not tears, something drier, more internal, like a structure shifting under load. She breathed through her nose and kept her face still and looked at the combination safe on the opposite wall. Open it, she said. Mireia, open it. The combination took him another 30 seconds. The safe opened with a sound like something releasing a breath it had been holding since 2009. Inside, on a single shelf, sat 2 objects, a black external hard drive secured in an evidence bag, and beneath it, in a waterproof sleeve, a ledger. Composition notebook style. The cover was dark green, water-stained, one corner burned to a brown crisp. Inside, she could see through the plastic, pages of dense handwriting in 2 colors of ink, with columns of numbers and names and dates interspersed with what looked like copied document headers. Her father's handwriting. She knew it was his before she could have explained how she knew. She reached for it. Ian's hand closed over her wrist. Not hard, just present. We take both, and we move, he said. We can't stay down here. I know. She pulled her wrist free and took the ledger and the hard drive both. Her hands weren't shaking anymore, which surprised her. Who else knows this room exists? Cassian. Whoever he's trusted with it over the years, possibly his security chief, Dorian Vale. He stopped. She looked at him. Vale. A muscle in his jaw moved. It may be coincidental. Dorian Vale. She said the name and felt it sit in her mouth with the specific weight of something she'd heard before in a context she couldn't locate. That's my name. My last name. I know. You knew before tonight. Yes. The air between them changed. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at him in the ballroom, with that same involuntary directness she'd never been able to fully control. How much of my being in this house was coincidence, she said. He didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. Lucienne, I didn't place you here. He said it steady, meeting her eyes. I found out you were here 14 months ago. A source confirmed your employment. I made the decision not to move you because moving you would have told Cassian I knew where you were, which would have accelerated whatever he was planning. He paused. I watched. I waited for an opening. You watched. Her voice was very even. For 14 months, while I cleaned his floors. While I built the case to burn him down properly, instead of just pulling you out and leaving the whole infrastructure intact to replace you with someone else. His voice hadn't lost its steadiness, but there was something underneath it now. Not guilt exactly, but the acknowledgement of a cost. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like you used me as bait. It sounds like I made a calculated decision that I would make again. He held her gaze. And I'm telling you that knowing you might not come with me after I do. The ceiling above them shuddered. Dust filtered down from the concrete joints. Someone was running overhead, multiple sets of feet, the kind of weight that suggested armed personnel rather than panicked guests. Mireia looked at the ledger in her hands. She looked at the burned corner and the water stains and the dense columns of her dead father's handwriting. She thought about 14 months of scrubbing floors and lowering her eyes and surviving by being invisible in a house owned by the man who had ordered her father burned alive. We move, she said. Tell me about the exit. They were halfway back to the staircase when the door at the top opened. Not Cassian's men. Not yet. It was Riva Sorin who came down those stairs, and that was almost worse because Mireia knew Riva. Had worked alongside her for 3 years. Riva was 40, dark-haired, quiet in the same way Mireia was quiet, through practice, through deliberate cultivation. She handled security scheduling for the estate's domestic staff. She had once covered a shift for Mireia when Mireia had been sick without being asked and hadn't mentioned it afterward. She came down the stairs with a gun in her hand and her face showing nothing. Mireia stopped moving. Lucienne stopped half a step behind her, and she felt rather than saw his hand move toward his own weapon. Don't, Riva said, not to Mireia, to Lucienne. I will put you down before your hand clears the holster, and we both know it. Reva, Mireia's voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. What is this? Riva's eyes moved to the ledger in Mireia's hands and stayed there. Something moved across her face. Complicated, compressed. Put it down. No. Mireia, put it down and step away from Dragor, and I will walk you out of here. That's the deal I've been given. Given by who? A pause. Cassian wants the ledger. He doesn't want you hurt. He's willing to... Cassian killed my father. The words landed in the concrete room and sat there. Riva's face did something involuntary. A small contraction around the eyes that could have been surprise or could have been pain. She recovered it in under a second. I know, she said. You know. Mireia stared at her. How long? Long enough. How long have you known I was Seraphine Arden? Another pause. Longer. Since your second week here. The structure behind Mireia's eyes shifted again, harder this time. 3 years. 3 years of Riva covering her shifts and lending her a jacket in winter, and sitting across from her in the staff kitchen at midnight, eating reheated food and talking about nothing important. 3 years of what Mireia had understood to be the closest thing she had to a friend in this building. You reported to Cassian, Mireia said. I reported that you didn't remember anything and posed no immediate threat. I argued against moving you. Riva's voice had gone tight. I kept you safe. You kept me in a cage. I kept you alive. Something cracked in Riva's composure, small like a hairline fracture, but it was there. Do you understand what Cassian would have done if I told him the full picture? If I told him you were the accountant's daughter, and not just a vagrant who happened to share a face with an old ghost? Her hand on the gun was steady, but her breathing wasn't anymore. He would have burned you the way he burned your father. I have been standing between you and that for 3 years. While working for him. While surviving. The same thing you've been doing. The ceiling shuddered again. Louder now. Something above had caught fire or been breached. She could smell it even here, acrid, chemical, the specific smell of a building being damaged beyond its intended tolerances. Lucien spoke from behind Mireia, quiet and precise. Reva Soren, I know who you are. I know what you've been doing in this house, and I know it isn't what Cassian thinks it is. A beat. I also know that the federal contact you've been feeding information to for the last 2 years is currently staged 2 miles east of this property with 43 agents waiting for a signal. Reva went absolutely still. The signal being the ledger reaching a verifiable location, Lucien continued, which it will, the moment we exit this building, which means your work here is done, which means the only question left is whether you walk out with us or stay down here and explain to Cassian's men why you let us leave. Something passed across Reva's face that Mireia had never seen there in 3 years of working alongside her. Not weakness, the opposite. The specific expression of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been given permission to set it down. She lowered the gun. There's a vehicle in the North Service tunnel, she said. Keys above the left wheel well. You have maybe 6 minutes before Dorian's team reaches this level. Come with us, Mireia said. Reva looked at her. The complicated thing moved across her face again. I have 3 more things to do in this building before I'm done. She moved aside from the staircase. Go. Mireia looked at her for 1 more second, trying to find the woman she'd thought she knew inside the woman who had been reporting to a federal asset for 2 years while maintaining a cover inside a mafia estate. And found, unexpectedly, that she could see both, that they were the same person. That people survived by becoming more than one thing simultaneously, and that wasn't always a lie. Sometimes it was just the geometry of staying alive. She went up the stairs. The estate above the archive level was unrecognizable. The east wing was actively burning. She could see it through the windows at the end of the corridor, orange light guttering against the rain, smoke moving in low billows along the ceiling of the hallway. Someone had overturned a catering table in the main corridor, and it lay on its side with food and shattered crockery scattered across 15 feet of carpet. There was blood on the wall near the east ballroom entrance. Smear, not a pool, suggesting someone had been moved after being hit. Lucien moved fast and quiet, and she stayed with him, the ledger and hard drive pressed against her chest. The ivory silk gown absurd in this context, but also, in some way she couldn't articulate, appropriate. She had never been more out of place in this building than she was right now, which meant she was finally, actually, herself inside it. They reached the North Service tunnel entrance through a maintenance door behind the kitchen. The kitchen was empty. Staff evacuated or fled, but the industrial equipment was still running, exhaust fans cycling, the smell of gas and old grease thick in the air. The tunnel was narrow, concrete, lit by strip lighting every 20 meters. The vehicle Reva had described was a black panel van, unremarkable, the kind of thing that could have belonged to a catering company or a cleaning service. Mireia found the keys above the wheel, well exactly where she'd been told. She stopped. I drive, she said. Lucien looked at her. I drive, she repeated. Give me one reason that's not a good idea. He studied her face for a second. Then he moved around to the passenger side without saying anything, which was the right call. She got in, put the ledger on the console between them, started the engine. The tunnel ran north for approximately 400 meters before it opened through a loading gate onto a service road that connected to the estate's outer perimeter. Mireia drove it with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the concrete ahead, and her mind running 2 separate tracks simultaneously. The immediate track, which was about driving and exits and the sound of the gate opening, and the deeper track, which was about a green composition notebook in a burned corner and columns of numbers written in her father's hand. He knew he was going to die, she said. Not a question. Lucien was watching the tunnel walls. From what I understand of the timeline, yes, he had roughly 3 weeks between when Cassian was tipped off and when the warehouse was burned. He spent that time securing the evidence. He didn't run. No. He could have. With me. He could have. She drove. The gate sensor picked up the van and the mechanism engaged. Slow, grinding, the heavy steel panels retracting into the walls. He left the ledger where an 8-year-old could find it, she said. Lucien was quiet for a moment. He left it where he thought you'd be safe. I think he expected you to find it later, when you were older, when you understood what it meant. He expected me to come back. I think he expected you to survive. The rest was a pause. I think he did what he could with the time he had. The gate finished opening. Rain hammered the van roof as she pulled out onto the service road, headlights off, feeling her way forward by the ambient glow of the estate burning somewhere behind her. She was 300 meters down the service road when the lights came on. Not headlights, floods mounted on vehicles. The kind of illumination that turned darkness into a wall of white and made everything inside it visible and exposed. They came on from both sides of the road simultaneously, and in their glare Mireia could see the vehicles. Black SUVs, 4 of them, positioned to block both directions with practiced efficiency. She hit the brakes. The van stopped. The engine idled. Rain hit the windshield in waves. "That's not federal," Lucien said. His voice had gone very flat. "No," she said. "That's Dorian." The figure who stepped out of the lead vehicle into the flood-lit rain was tall, gray-haired, wearing a tactical vest over a dress shirt. The specific absurdity of a man who had been at the Gala an hour ago and was now deployed for an intercept. He walked toward the van without hurrying, which said everything about how confident he was in the current arrangement. Dorian Vale, security chief of the Vespera estate, the man who shared her last name. He stopped 10 feet from the van's front bumper and looked through the windshield at her. His face in the floodlights was unreadable. Then he raised one hand and made a small, deliberate gesture, 2 fingers pointing down, the unmistakable signal for come out. Mireia's hands were on the wheel. The ledger was on the console. The engine was still running. "Options," she said quietly. "Ram the left vehicle. There's a gap between the rear bumper and the drainage ditch, maybe 4 feet. The van can make it if we hit it at the right angle. And if we don't make it, then we're in the ditch and we're on foot." She looked at Dorian Vale standing in the rain with his hand still raised and his face still unreadable, and she thought about the name. Vale. The name that had been given to her by the state at 9 years old when they'd processed a child with no documented history, no known family, no name that anyone could verify. The state didn't assign last names to orphaned children. They used existing records or next-of-kin documentation. "He filed the paperwork," she said. Lucien went still beside her. "When I entered the system." Her voice was very quiet and very steady. "Someone filed documentation that gave me the name Vale. The state doesn't invent last names. Someone provided it." She looked at Dorian through the rain-blurred windshield. "He's known who I was since I was 9 years old." Lucien said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "He's not Cassian's security chief," she said. "Or he's not only that." She was working it out as she spoke, the pieces dropping into configuration with the specific horrible clarity of things that had been true for a long time finally becoming visible. "He's been tracking me, through the name, through the system. That's how I ended up here. That's how I ended up at the Vespera estate, specifically, of every household in the country I could have been placed with." She turned to look at Lucien. "Did you know?" The pause was half a second too long. "I suspected," he said. She hit the accelerator. The van surged forward and Dorian Vale threw himself sideways, and the left SUV's rear quarter panel came up fast in the headlights, and she aimed for the gap between its bumper and the ditch edge, with both hands locked on the wheel, and her teeth set hard against each other, and the sound of the impact was a full-body concussion, metal on metal, the van's front panel crumpling, the SUV spinning partially into the ditch. And then they were through, fishtailing on wet grass. And she corrected, and they were on the service road heading north, and behind them she could hear doors opening and engines starting, and Dorian Vale's voice in the rain shouting something she was already too far away to hear. Her hands were shaking now, finally. She let them shake and kept driving. "The federal staging area," she said. "Reva's contact. 2 miles east, there's a turnoff. I know where east is." She drove. The estate shrank in the mirrors, orange light and flood beams and chaos reducing to a smear against the dark. Rain hammered the crumpled hood. The engine was running rough. Something in the front end had been damaged in the collision, but it was running, and right now running was enough. On the console between them, her father's ledger sat in its waterproof sleeve, dry and intact and containing 15 years of deferred consequence. And somewhere behind her in the burning estate, Cassian Vespera was learning that his archive was gone, his security chief had failed, and the girl he had kept in plain sight for 4 years was driving away with the only thing that could end everything he'd... The engine died 400 meters from the federal staging area. Not dramatically, no explosion, no seizure, just a gradual loss of pressure that Mireia felt through the steering column before she heard it. The van losing power the way a person lost consciousness. In degrees, then all at once. She guided it onto the grass shoulder on instinct, both hands working the wheel against the sudden dead weight of unpowered steering, and it rolled to a stop in the wet dark with the hood still ticking from the collision damage and rain drumming the roof in sheets. She sat with her hands on the wheel for exactly 2 seconds. "We walk," she said. The ledger. She was already picking it up off the console. The hard drive went inside the bodice of the gown. She pushed it flat against her ribs, feeling the plastic edge bite into her skin, and pulled the silk tight over it. The ledger she held against her chest with one arm, the waterproof sleeve cold and slick in the crook of her elbow. She got out of the van into the rain. The cold hit her like a physical thing. She was still in the ivory gown, still in Daniela Vespera's heels, and the combination of wet silk against skin and the temperature drop from the storm made her breath stutter for a moment before she locked it down. The grass under her feet was waterlogged, soft, and the heels sank 2 inches with every step. She reached down without breaking stride and pulled them off one at a time, carrying them in her free hand for 3 steps before dropping them entirely. The wet grass was sharp and cold against her bare feet, and she kept moving. Lucien came around the van and fell into step beside her. He'd shed his jacket at some point, she didn't know when, and had it in his hand. He held it out to her without speaking. She looked at it for half a second, weighing the symbolism against the practical reality of being wet and cold in the middle of a field, and took it. She pulled it over her shoulders without putting her arms through the sleeves, keeping one arm free for the ledger. 2 miles east. In this rain, moving fast, 8 minutes. Maybe 10. They moved through the field in silence. The estate was behind them. She could see the light from it even now, that dirty orange smear against the low clouds. And there was something final about seeing it recede, something she hadn't expected to feel so physical. 4 years. 4 years of that building's rhythms in her body, the creak of the East Corridor floorboards, the smell of the kitchen at 6 in the morning, the specific quality of silence in the staff wing after midnight. You didn't stop carrying a place just because you left it. "The name," she said. Her voice was flat, conversational, which was not how she felt. Lucien didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "What do you want to know?" "How long have you known Dorian Vale placed me in the system?" "I've suspected it for 8 months. I confirmed it 3 weeks ago." He was watching the field ahead, the dark horizon, moving with the practiced ground coverage of someone who had covered difficult terrain in bad conditions before. A source inside the Illinois DCFS pulled the original intake documentation on a Mireia Vale, minor, age 9, no verifiable prior documentation, entered the system October 31, 2009. The referral paperwork was filed by a private attorney named Gould, who dissolved his practice in 2010. Gould's former office address shared a building with a shell company registered to a holding group that traces back to Vespera estate operations. She absorbed this, kept walking. "He didn't place me here to protect me," she said. "No. He placed me here to watch me, to keep me close enough to contain if the memories surfaced." She said it clinically, which was the only way she could say it without the clinical tone fracturing into something else. "Cassian knew I existed. He didn't kill me because you were more useful as a monitoring problem than a confirmed death. A dead child connected to the Halcourt fire creates forensic questions. A living child with no memory, placed under observation, creates control." Lucien's voice was even, informational, and she understood he was giving her facts instead of softness, because he'd read her correctly enough to know she needed the facts right now, and softness could come later or never. As long as you didn't remember, you were contained. The moment you became a threat, the protocol changed. The protocol changed tonight. Yes. Because of the gala. Because 37 crime family representatives saw my face and recognized the white ghost, and Cassian couldn't contain that information anymore. She worked through it as she walked, the pieces clicking together with horrible precision. He was going to use tonight's gala as cover. The chaos. Whatever he was planning, the attacks on the ballroom, it was designed to eliminate the witnesses while eliminating me. Lucian was quiet for 3 steps. Not exactly, he said. Something in his tone stopped her. Not her feet. She kept walking. But something internal stopped, a gear catching. Then exactly what? She said. Another pause. Longer. The attacks on the ballroom were not Cassian's operation, Lucian said. She turned her head and looked at his profile in the rain dark. His jaw was set. He was looking ahead. Whose were they? She said. Mine. The word landed in the wet field between them, and she stopped walking. Actually stopped. Feet in the waterlogged grass, rain hitting the borrowed jacket across her shoulders, and looked at him. He stopped too, turned to face her. Explain that, she said. Her voice had gone to something very quiet, which she'd learned years ago was a more accurate indicator of her internal state than volume. I needed Cassian destabilized. I needed the estate breached and the gala fractured before he could execute his own timeline. My people initiated the ballroom engagement to accelerate. Your people shot at those guests. My people fired into ceiling fixtures. No one in that ballroom was targeted. The objective was panic and dispersal, not casualties. His voice was controlled. It worked. It worked. She looked at him. The rain ran down her face, and she didn't move to wipe it. 40-some people in that ballroom, staff, musicians, guests who had nothing to do with. Every guest in that ballroom represented a crime family with active operations. There were no civilians. There was me, she said. There was me in that ballroom in a gown I didn't choose, representing a family I don't belong to, with no weapon and no knowledge of what was about to happen. She watched his face. Did you know I would be there? The pause this time was different from the others, shorter, more controlled. I knew there was an elevated probability, he said. The cold in her chest was not from the rain. You knew Cassian would pull someone from the domestic staff to cover for Daniela, she said slowly. You knew, or suspected, that the staff member he chose would be me, because I was the right height, because he'd been keeping me specifically, and you initiated the ballroom breach anyway. She breathed through the calculation of it. You put me in that room on purpose. I put you in a position where you would need to move, and I would be positioned to move with you. His voice hadn't changed a register, but something underneath it had shifted. The acknowledgement again, that same cost awareness from the archive room. The look of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to account for it, but not to apologize for it. If I'd pulled you out of this estate 3 months ago, Cassian would have known I had you. He would have moved on the ledger, moved on the archive, and disappeared everything before any federal action could touch him. I needed him in the building when it happened. I needed the ledger in hand and the estate compromised before he could initiate a clean exit. And I was the mechanism. You were the variable that made the timing work. A beat. I'm not going to tell you that's not what it was. She looked at him for a long moment, the rain between them, his face open to whatever she gave back, not braced, not defensive, just present with what he'd done and what it meant. How long, she said. How long have you actually been watching me? Since I found the reference to the Arden file. 14 months. 14 months, she exhaled. And the night you found out where I was, what was the first thing you felt? He held her gaze. Something moved in his eyes that she hadn't seen there before. Not calculation, not the controlled steadiness of a man managing a situation. Something older. Something that had been sitting behind the steadiness for a long time and had just been given a question that was actually asking for it. Relief, he said. The first thing I felt was relief. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't cost more than she had available right now. She started walking again. He fell back into step. Ahead, through the rain and the dark, She could begin to make out the shapes of vehicles, dark, blocky, positioned along a tree line. The staging area, lights off but present, the way federal assets were present, carefully, containing their footprint until it was time to stop containing it. Riva's contact, she said. Do you trust them? I trust their interests align with the outcome we need. He paused. Which isn't the same thing, but it's functional. What's their name? Harlan Voss, Assistant Special Agent in charge out of the Chicago field office. He's been building the Vespera RICO case for 6 years. Riva has been his primary inside source for 2 of those. Another pause. He's also the agent who has been sitting on the Halcourt fire investigation since 2009. She processed this. Sitting on it meaning it was opened and closed inside of 4 months with an official finding of accidental electrical failure. No further investigation. He said it evenly. Whether that was Voss's call or someone above him, I don't know. It's one of the reasons I've been building a parallel track rather than trusting the federal process entirely. She thought about that, about Riva trusting Voss with 2 years of inside information, about the Halcourt investigation closed and buried, about parallel tracks and functional trust, and what any of it actually meant when you were barefoot in a field in the rain holding your dead father's ledger. If Voss buried the fire investigation, she said, he may not want the ledger to surface what he buried. Lucien said nothing. Lucien, it's a risk I've been aware of. And you were planning to walk me directly into his staging area. I was planning to walk you into his staging area while simultaneously ensuring that the ledger's contents were transmitted to 4 separate secondary contacts before anyone in that staging area had a chance to review what we were carrying. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a phone. His own, she realized, which meant he'd had it the entire time. The hard drive against your ribs has a wireless transmit function. The moment it came within range of a live cellular signal, it began uploading to a distributed archive I've been building for 3 years. By the time we reach Voss, there will be nothing in that drive worth suppressing. The information will already be beyond anyone's ability to contain. She stared at him. The range on the transmit function activated when we cleared the estate perimeter, he continued, approximately 6 minutes ago. You built a dead man's switch into the evidence. I built an inevitability into the evidence, yes. And you didn't tell me. I'm telling you now. She wanted to be angry. She was angry. It was there. A real heat in her chest, underneath the cold and the exhaustion. The specific anger of someone who had been moved through a situation by another person's architecture without being given the full blueprint. She had a right to that anger, and she knew she had a right to it. She also understood, with a clarity that felt like something her body knew before her mind did, that the man walking beside her through a rainy field had spent 15 years carrying a version of this night in his head. That the architecture he'd built around her had been, by his own admission, without apology, designed to burn down the man who had burned her father alive. Both things were true. She held both things and kept walking. The staging area resolved into specifics as they approached. 4 dark SUVs, a mobile command unit disguised as a utility van, 8 visible agents in plainclothes positioned along the tree line. A 9th figure stood separate from the others, near the front vehicle, facing their approach. Harlan Voss was 52 or 3, compact, with the kind of weathered stillness that came from years of surveillance work, the ability to occupy space without drawing attention to it, except that right now he was the center of this particular arrangement, and the stillness read differently. He had a phone in one hand and was looking at it as they approached. When he looked up and saw them, saw Mireia specifically, barefoot and rain-soaked in an ivory gown with a ledger under her arm, and Lucien Dragor's jacket on her shoulders. His expression did something compressed and unreadable. Dragor, he said. Voss? Voss's eyes moved to Mireia, stayed there. And you're Seraphine Arden, she said. The name came out of her mouth for the first time in her adult life, and she felt it land in her own chest like something reclaiming territory. Elias Arden's daughter. Something moved across Voss's face. She watched it happen. Watched the compression and the recompression. The rapid internal calculation of a man who had just had a significant variable arrive earlier and in better condition than expected. "We need to move you to the command vehicle," he said. "Get you out of—" "I need something from you first," she said. He looked at her. The assessment in his eyes was specific, the look of someone determining how much of a problem she was going to be. "The Halcourt fire investigation," she said. 2009. Closed with a finding of accidental electrical failure. She watched his face. "Who made that call?" A beat. "That's not a conversation for— It's a conversation for right now, in this field, before I hand you anything." She kept her voice level. "Because the man who ordered that fire is inside that estate, and if the investigation was closed to protect someone in your chain of command, then the moment I walk into your command vehicle, I become a problem that needs to be managed rather than a witness that needs to be protected." She held his gaze. "So, tell me who made the call." Voss was quiet for 4 seconds. The agents along the tree line were motionless. Rain fell. "Regional director at the time," Voss said finally. "Man named Croft. He retired in 2012. A pause that cost him something. "He was on 3 of the accounts in the Vespera financial network. We identified it 18 months ago." "Is he contained?" "He's under surveillance." "Is he contained?" A longer pause. "No," she breathed. "So the man who buried my father's murder investigation is still free, and you've been running a 2-year RICO case on the organization that paid him to do it." She looked at him steadily. "And you were waiting for the ledger." "The ledger closes the case in a way nothing else can. The ledger also closes Croft, which is why you needed it badly enough to run a 2-year inside source operation instead of moving on Vespera directly when you had sufficient cause." She watched his face confirm what she was saying without him saying it. "Because Vespera's testimony implicates Croft, and Croft implicates the regional office, and the regional office implicates—" She stopped. "How far up does it go?" Voss said nothing, which was its own answer. The cold in her chest spread outward. Not fear exactly, something more structural. The recognition of a problem's actual scale after having spent time believing it was smaller. "Dragor," Voss said, shifting his gaze. "We had an arrangement." "The arrangement was the ledger for protection and prosecution," Lucian said. "The arrangement didn't specify that she'd come out of that estate with a full understanding of the institutional dimensions." His voice was even. "She's a fast study." "The arrangement also didn't specify that you'd transmit the drive contents before delivery," Voss said, and the even quality of his voice had developed an edge. "My people are showing active transmission from an external archive. You uploaded before we had verification of—" "Yes," Lucian said simply. The edge in Voss's voice sharpened. "That was not the agreed protocol." "The agreed protocol assumed she'd come out of that estate without knowing how deep the contamination in your office goes." Lucien's voice stayed flat. "The upload ensures that the outcome of tonight doesn't depend on any single decision by any single person, including you." A beat. "That was always going to be true. I simply confirmed it before the conversation." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Mireia. She looked back, rain on her face, her father's ledger under her arm. 14 months of being someone's carefully positioned variable. A name she'd just spoken aloud for the first time in 15 years. "Where is Cassian now?" she said. Voss checked his phone. "Last confirmed position puts him in the north wing of the estate. His helicopter pad on the roof has a bird staged and fueled." He paused. "We've had a no-fly order in place for this airspace for the last 40 minutes. He can't take off. But he's still inside. His security team is heavily armed and the estate is structurally compromised from the fire, moving in without significant—" "I'm going back in," she said. Both men looked at her. "Absolutely not," Voss said. "He has to be taken with the ledger in hand," she said. Not from a transmitted archive that his lawyers can spend 3 years contesting the chain of custody on. With the physical original presented by the person whose father he murdered, in front of federal witnesses." She looked at Voss. "You know I'm right. That's a case that doesn't get buried by contaminated regional directors. That's a case that goes straight up the chain because the optics of suppressing it become impossible. You're a civilian. I'm the surviving material witness to the Halcourt fire and the daughter of the man who built the evidence archive you've been trying to reconstruct for 6 years. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't let it. I'm also the only person in this field who has spent 4 years learning every service entrance, back corridor, and structural weakness in that building. She turned to Lucian. You know the rooftop access. North stairwell, he said immediately, which told her he'd already been thinking it. Lucian. Voss's voice had gone hard. We have an extraction agreement. The terms, Lucian said, are whatever she decides they are. He said it like it was simple, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like 15 months of architecture and positioning and calculated use of her as a variable had resolved, at the end, into this. Whatever she decided. She looked at him. He looked back. His face was open in the rain, not asking her permission for what had come before, not offering it, just present with the fact of what was in front of them and genuinely completely deferring to her on where it went next. She turned back to the estate. The orange light was still there, guttering against the clouds. Somewhere inside it, Cassian Vespera was preparing his exit. He would be moving toward the roof. He would be moving with the controlled efficiency of a man who had constructed 70 years of survival out of having a next move ready before the current one finished. She thought about her father handing a green composition notebook to an 8-year-old in a burning building and whispering something she hadn't been able to hear clearly for 15 years. She thought about the words she'd always assumed were run or go or something directional. Standing in the rain with the ledger against her chest and the hard drive pressed to her ribs, she finally understood what he'd actually said. Not run. Come back. She turned to Voss. Get your people to the north perimeter, she said. Give me 20 minutes. Voss stared at her. 18, she amended. Lucian knows the building. We go in through the service tunnel, up the north stairwell, roof access. You have people staged at every ground exit so he can't walk out. When we come down from that roof, you have your case. She held out the ledger toward Voss. Hold this. If we're not out in 20 minutes, you come in anyway, and you use what's already uploaded. She paused. But we'll be out. Voss took the ledger. His hands were careful with it. Almost involuntarily careful, the way people were careful with things they'd been trying to reach for a long time. He looked at Lucian. You're going to let her walk back into... So, I'm not letting her do anything, Lucian said. I'm going with her. Maria was already turning back toward the estate. The rain hit her face and the wet grass was cold under her bare feet, and somewhere in the building ahead of her, the man who had ended her father's life was 60 seconds from a helicopter that couldn't legally take off and didn't know it yet. She walked toward the orange light. Lucian's footsteps came up alongside her in the dark, matching her pace without being asked, and they moved through the field together toward the burning estate, toward the north service tunnel, toward the stairwell, toward 31 floors of consequence that had been waiting 15 years for someone to climb them. And somewhere behind her, Voss was already on his radio, and the field was filling with quiet, controlled movement, and the night was tilting toward its... The north service tunnel smelled of smoke now. Not the clean smoke of a contained fire. This was the thick, chemical-edged smoke of a building burning through its own infrastructure, insulation and wiring and decades of accumulated material giving off the specific toxicity of things not meant to burn. Maria felt it in her throat the moment they entered, a low scratch that would build if they stayed long enough, and she breathed through her nose and kept moving. Lucian had taken a weapon from one of Voss's agents at the perimeter. A brief, wordless transaction. The agent looking at Maria's bare feet and rain-soaked gown and having the professional sense not to comment. He moved through the tunnel ahead of her now, not fast enough to pull away, maintaining the kind of interval that kept him useful as a forward position without leaving her exposed behind. She watched the way he moved. Economical, low impact, weight distributed for quick direction changes, and filed it without sentiment. She needed to know what he was capable of in the next 18 minutes. She'd assess the rest later. Her feet found the concrete of the tunnel floor rough and gritty, and she was grateful for it. Smooth surface would have been treacherous at speed. She ran an inventory of her body as she moved. Bare feet, functional. Wet dress, restricted leg movement, but manageable if she stayed aware of it. The hard drive was still against her ribs. the edge of it leaving a mark she could feel with every breath. Her hands were empty, and she intended to keep them that way for as long as possible, because she'd never fired a weapon in her life, and this was not the night to discover her limitations with one. What she had instead was the building, 4 years, every service corridor, every maintenance access point, every structural idiosyncrasy that only revealed itself to someone who cleaned it weekly and moved through it in the margins of other people's lives. She knew which sections of the North Wing had fire suppression systems that had been offline since a pipe burst in 2022 and were never repaired because Cassian had decided the insurance adjustment was preferable to the contractor bill. She knew that the north stairwell's third-floor landing had a door that locked from the inside but not the outside, which meant it could be used as a choke point. She knew that the rooftop access door had a hydraulic closer that failed in cold weather and could be propped with the right object. She knew this building the way you knew something you'd never been invited to own but had been forced to maintain regardless. "Second left," she said. Lucian took it without hesitation. She'd noticed he did that, followed her directions in this building without the half-second of male recalibration she'd braced for. She didn't have time to evaluate what that meant, but she noted it. The tunnel opened into the North Wing service lobby, a utilitarian space, bare concrete, a freight elevator on the left wall, and the stairwell door straight ahead. The freight elevator was dark, the power to this section inconsistent from fire damage. The stairwell was their only option, which she'd known before they entered. She hit the door and they started up. The smoke was worse in the stairwell. It collected in the upper sections, the natural physics of it rising and pooling against the ceiling, so the first 2 floors were relatively clear, and by the third it was a visible haze, and by the 5th she was pulling the collar of Lucien's jacket up over her nose and breathing through the fabric. Her eyes were streaming, not crying, just the mechanical response of mucous membranes to particulates, but the tears blurred her vision and she blinked them clear repeatedly and kept climbing. 4 flights. 5. The stairwell echoed with their footsteps, and beneath that the building's own sounds, the low structural groan of a large structure under thermal stress, the distant percussion of what she identified as a section of ceiling collapsing somewhere in the east wing, the sporadic crackle of active fire audible through the walls. 6th floor landing. The door here was warm to the touch when she checked it with the back of her hand. Not dangerously hot, but warm enough to tell her the corridor beyond was compromised. She shook her head, and they kept climbing. 7th floor. The rooftop access was here. Not the main roof door, which would be monitored, but the mechanical room access that connected to the HVAC platform that adjoined the main rooftop. She'd been up here exactly once, 2 years ago, tracking a water leak that had been traced to a failed roof seal. The facilities manager had sent her up with a camera to document the damage. She had documented it, and also, because she always documented buildings, memorized the layout. She pushed through the 7th floor door. The corridor here was clearer, smoke present but not incapacitating. She moved fast toward the mechanical room, Lucien right behind her, and tried the handle. Locked. She'd expected this. She crouched and looked at the lock. Standard commercial keypad, the same model used throughout the estate's utility spaces. She knew the master code, had known it for 3 years, the way you knew things you weren't supposed to know when you moved invisibly through spaces where people spoke freely because they didn't register your presence as an audience. She punched in the 6 digits. The lock released. Lucien made a small sound behind her. Not surprise exactly, more like a man revising an estimate upward. The mechanical room was hot. The HVAC systems were partially running, pulling smoke-contaminated air through ducts and cycling it with diminishing effectiveness. And the equipment itself generated heat that combined with the building's overall thermal load into something that pressed against her skin immediately. She moved through it by memory, around the primary air handler, past the condenser banks, toward the exterior access panel on the north wall. The panel opened onto a metal grate platform, exposed to the night. Rain coming in hard and cold and immediately preferable to the heat inside. She stepped out onto it and felt the wet metal grate under her feet and breathed rain-cleaned air for the first time in 20 minutes, and her lungs opened up with something close to gratitude. The HVAC platform connected to the main rooftop by a short ladder. 8 rungs, maybe 10 feet of vertical rise. Above the ladder's top, she could see the edge of the main roofline, and beyond it, the spinning navigation lights of the helicopter. It was still there, still staged. Engine running, she could hear it now. The high turbine whine cutting through the rain and the wind, the rotors at idle speed turning slowly. The pilot was in the aircraft. Whoever was going up with Cassian was already in position. She started up the ladder. Mireia! Lucien's hand on her ankle. Not restraining, just contact, making her stop. She looked down at him. His face was upturned, rain on it, and he was doing the calculation she recognized because she'd been running it herself for the last 8 minutes. There will be security on that roof, he said. Yes. At minimum 2, possibly 4. I know. You don't have a weapon. I know that too. She held his gaze. I have the building, I have the element of surprise, and I have the fact that Cassian thinks I'm either dead or in federal custody, which means his security posture on that roof is oriented toward departure, not defense. She paused. You have the gun. Stay behind me until we're over the roofline, and then you go left because there will be someone positioned at the helicopter's 9 o'clock, and someone at the stairwell access, and someone with Cassian directly. She watched his face. Can you handle 2? He looked at her for 1 second. Go, he said. She went up the ladder. The rooftop of Black Marrow Estate was large. The main building's footprint was substantial, and the rooftop reflected that. A broad expanse of modified bitumen membrane broken by HVAC, equipment housings, skylights, and the elevated helicopter pad at the north end. The pad was lit by its own LED perimeter lighting, bright enough to create a distinct pool of visibility that ended sharply at its edges, leaving the rest of the roof in relative darkness, punctuated only by the estate's emergency lighting and the orange glow from the fire below filtering up through the skylights. The helicopter was a mid-size executive model. She didn't know aircraft well enough to name it, but it was built for speed and range, not capacity, which meant Cassian was traveling light. The rotors were picking up speed as she cleared the roofline. Someone had given a departure signal recently. She came up onto the roof in a low crouch and moved immediately to the nearest HVAC housing, pressing herself against its wet metal flank and going still. 3 seconds of assessment. Security, 2 visible. 1 near the helicopter's left side, facing outward toward the roof's perimeter. Tall, tactical vest, weapon at low ready. 1 at the stairwell access door on the east side of the pad. Compact, dark jacket, scanning. Neither was looking at the HVAC platform access point. Neither expected anyone to come from below. Cassian was at the helicopter's door. He was wearing his Gala suit, which was wrong in the context of the roof and the rain and the burning building below. And that wrongness made him look, for the first time she could remember, actually human. An old man in an expensive suit standing in the rain at the door of a helicopter, carrying a leather attaché case that she suspected contained whatever backup documentation he'd had staged for precisely this kind of exit. Dorian Vale was not on the roof. She filed that and kept it. Dorian was somewhere between the service road and here, and his absence meant he was either blocked by Voss's perimeter or still mobile, which was a problem for 17 minutes from now. She looked back down through the access and found Lucien 2 rungs below the top, waiting. She held up 2 fingers, pointed left, pointed right. He nodded. She held up 3 fingers, counted them down. On 1, she moved. She came out of the shadow of the HVAC housing at a dead run across wet roofing membrane, bare feet finding purchase better than the heels would have, closing the distance to the helicopter pad perimeter in 4 seconds. The guard at the left side of the aircraft heard her on the 3rd step. She was not a trained operator and she was not silent, and started to turn, and she hit him at full speed with her shoulder into his chest, using her momentum and his unbalanced turn against him. And they went down together onto the pad surface in a collision that drove the breath out of both of them. The impact was brutal. Her shoulder took the concrete edge of the pad lip, and the pain was immediate and white-edged. She registered it and moved past it, purely on adrenaline, because stopping to assess damage was a luxury. She had his weapon arm pinned under her weight for half a second, and she used that half second to drive her elbow into his jaw with everything she had. His head snapped back. He went slack. She was upright in under 2 seconds. The second guard at the stairwell was already moving toward her. She could hear his footsteps and see his shape in her peripheral vision. And Lucian came up over the roofline behind him and hit him from behind with the controlled efficiency of someone who had done this before, one arm around the throat, the other controlling the weapon hand, and the guard went down in a way that suggested he would stay down for a while. Cassian had turned. He was standing at the helicopter door and he was looking at her, at Seraphine Arden, barefoot on his rooftop in a rain-soaked ivory gown with a bruising shoulder and blood from the pad impact on her forearm and his dead employee at her feet. And his face was doing something she had never seen it do in 4 years. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The elegant patrician composure was so complete that its completeness was itself a tell. The face of a man suppressing a reaction so significant that suppressing it required the total occupation of his resources. His hand was on the attaché case. She watched his hand. "Seraphine," he said. The name in his mouth was wrong in a way she felt physically, like hearing a word in your own language spoken with the accent of someone who learned it to use against you. "Put the case down," she said. He didn't move. "I think you'll find the situation somewhat more complicated than put it down. You're barefoot on a roof in a burning building." His voice was level, almost gentle. The voice he used, she understood now when he was buying seconds. "You have no weapon. You have no authority. Whatever Dragor has told you, I know about the Halcourt fire," she said. "I know about Elias Arden. I know about Dorian Vale placing me in the state system. I know about your archive room." She kept her eyes on his face and her peripheral attention on his hand. "The ledger is already with federal agents. The drive has been uploaded to a distributed archive. There is nothing in that case that changes anything." He looked at her. The nothing on his face developed a hairline fracture, very small, at the corner of one eye, the compression of a man running calculations that are coming back wrong. "You were a child," he said. 8 years old. You understand nothing about what was actually... I understand my father spent his life building a case against you, and you had him burned alive for it." Her voice stayed level. She was surprised by that. She'd have expected more shake in it. "I understand you kept me in your house for 4 years cleaning your floors while knowing exactly who I was." She watched the hairline fracture deepen slightly. "That's what I understand." "You cleaned floors because you were nobody," he said. Something shifted in his voice, the gentleness dropping away, the thing underneath it colder and more honest. "Because a girl with no memory and no name and no history is nobody, Seraphine. I kept you alive. I could have ended you in the first week, and I didn't, because you were harmless and because killing me created more questions than keeping me," she said. "I know." Lucian explained the actuarial logic. She took one step onto the helicopter pad. "But you don't get to frame that as mercy. You kept me as an insurance policy, and you parked me in the basement of the life I should have had." He moved. Not for a weapon. She'd expected a weapon, had braced for it, but for the helicopter door, pulling it open and stepping up into the aircraft with the quick decisiveness of a man who had decided the conversation was at the point of diminishing returns. The pilot's turbine surged. "No fly order," she said loudly. "Federal airspace restriction. Your pilot knows. He's been holding on your order and hoping you'd change your mind about departure." The turbines didn't decrease. She'd miscalculated something. Then Lucien was at her shoulder and his voice carried over the rotor wash. "The pilot's been replaced. Sometime in the last 40 minutes, Cassian cycled out the contracted pilot and put in his own man." He said it directly into her ear, close enough that she felt the words rather than just heard them. "He's going to try to run the restriction. They'll intercept. If he gets high enough fast enough, it creates a situation, a negotiation. Cassian in an aircraft over federal airspace with whatever's in that case, threatening exposure of the Croft connection, threatening half a dozen other insurance provisions I guarantee he has loaded and ready." Lucian's hand was at her back. Not pushing, just present. If he gets off this roof, the calculus changes significantly. The helicopter's skids were still on the pad. Cassian was inside, door not yet closed, and through the rain and the rotor wash she could see him settling into the rear cabin, the attaché case on his knee, his face turned toward the cockpit with the specific, focused patience of a man waiting for confirmation. She was out of time. She ran for the helicopter, not with a plan, or not with a complete plan, more with the forward edge of one, the instinct of a woman who had been moving through rooms she didn't belong in for 20 years and had learned that the only way through was through. She hit the open door before it could close and grabbed the door frame and pulled herself up into the cabin, and Cassian turned, and for 1 second they were 18 inches apart in the confined space, his face finally showing something real. Not fear, because Cassian Vespera didn't have the architecture for fear in the ordinary sense, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood. Surprise that had calcified into threat assessment. His hand went for the case. She went for his hand. They struggled for the case in the cramped helicopter cabin, with the rotors screaming above them and the rain coming in through the open door and the pad lighting strobing through the windows as the aircraft began to lift. She felt the skids leave the surface, felt the stomach-dropping lightness of it, and knew they were airborne and the calculation had changed, and she didn't let go. Cassian was 61 and had not done physical work in decades, but he was stronger than he looked, which she'd half expected from a man who had survived 70 years by being underestimated. He got a hand around her wrist, the same wrist Lucien had held in the archive room, the one that was already bruised, and squeezed with the deliberate intensity of someone applying pressure as a tool. She felt her grip on the case weaken, and she shifted strategy, releasing the case entirely and instead driving the heel of her free hand up into his nose. Not a trained strike. Not precise. But she was 23 and furious, and her arm had the full weight of her body behind it, and the impact was enough. His head snapped back. The case fell to the cabin floor, his grip on her wrist released. She picked up the case. He was bleeding from the nose. A bright, immediate bleed, the kind that happened when cartilage was involved, and it was running over his upper lip and dropping onto the white front of his dress shirt. He looked at her with both hands braced on the seat, and his face showing something that had moved past threat assessment into something rawer. She was holding his case. She was in his helicopter, 40 feet above his burning estate, and she was holding the one thing he'd saved from everything below. "Land," she said to the cockpit. "Land the aircraft now." The pilot didn't respond. The helicopter was still climbing. Lucien's voice came from below, from the open door. She could hear him, and she understood he had not been able to reach the aircraft before it lifted, and she was in this cabin alone. "Mireia," his voice through the rotor wash. "The door." She looked at the open cabin door. The pad was below her, not far, 20 feet, 25, the LED perimeter lighting bright against the dark. And Lucien was standing at its edge, looking up at her with a weapon in his hand, and his face showing the first thing she'd seen on it all night that wasn't controlled. She looked at Cassian. He looked back at her, blood on his face, chest heaving, and underneath the rawness, still, that specific calculating coldness, the part of him that never fully stopped running numbers even when his nose was broken. "You won't jump," he said. The blood made his voice thick. "You're not—" "I'm Elias Arden's daughter," she said. She threw the case out the open door. It tumbled down through the rain and hit the pad surface and burst open, papers and drives and documents scattering across the wet concrete in a sudden explosive fan, and Cassian Vespera made a sound she had never heard a human being make. Not a shout, not a scream. Something lower and more fundamental. The sound of a man watching 60 years of contingency and control dissolve in a 2-second fall. He lunged for the door. She moved out of his way, stepped back and to the side, using the cabin wall to brace, and let his momentum carry him. He caught himself on the doorframe, both hands gripping, half out of the aircraft, staring down at the scattered documents on the pad below. The helicopter lurched. The pilot was compensating for the sudden weight shift, and the lurch threw Cassian's balance, and his left hand slipped, and for one moment, a full second, maybe longer, he was hanging by one hand from the doorframe of an aircraft 30 feet above a burning building, and the rain was hitting his face, and his eyes were wide with the specific undiluted terror of a man confronting a physics problem he cannot negotiate with. She grabbed his wrist. Both hands, full grip, her body braced against the seat frame. He looked up at her. The terror in his eyes meant something else. Something that crossed his face briefly in the way that certain things crossed a face when all the performance had been stripped away by the presence of the actual. She held him. "Tell the pilot to land," she said. His free hand came up and found the doorframe again, taking weight off her arms. The aircraft was still moving, drifting laterally, the pilot struggling with the situation. "Land the aircraft," Cassian said. His voice came out thin. "Land it." The helicopter descended. It was not graceful. The pilot brought it down in a controlled drop, skids hitting the pad hard enough to jar everyone inside, and the impact broke Maria's grip on Cassian's wrist, and she fell back against the rear seat and felt something in her shoulder that had been managing the pain since the pad impact stopped, managing it and start reporting it clearly. A white-hot signal from the joint that told her the damage was real, and she was going to feel it significantly when the adrenaline left. The skids were on the pad. She got out of the helicopter. The pad surface was wet and cold under her feet, and the rotor wash was still hitting her hard enough to make standing require active effort, and Cassian came down behind her and stood with both hands visible and blood drying on his face and said nothing. Below them, the estate was burning. Around them, the rain came down. And from the stairwell access on the east side of the pad, the door opened and 2 federal agents came through it in tactical gear. And behind them came Harlan Voss. And behind Voss came Reva Soren with a cut above her left eyebrow and a posture that said whatever her 3 remaining tasks had been, she had completed them. Lucienne was at her side. She didn't know when he'd reached her, sometime in the helicopter's descent, climbing back up to the pad. But he was there, and his hand was briefly at her elbow, and she didn't pull away from it. Voss looked at the scattered documents across the pad. He looked at Cassian. He looked at Maria, at the blood on her forearm, at the wet gown, at the bare feet on wet concrete, at the way she was holding her left shoulder slightly higher than her right to manage the joint. "You have him," she said. It came out rougher than she intended. Her throat was raw from the smoke. "We have him," Voss confirmed. 2 agents moved toward Cassian. He didn't resist. She watched him make the decision not to resist, watched it happen as a calculation rather than a surrender, which was the most honest thing she'd seen him do. One of the agents had a collection bag for the documents scattered across the pad and was moving through them with practiced efficiency, pulling them from puddles and retrieving them from under the helicopter's landing skids. She watched Cassian's face as his hands were secured behind him. He was looking at her. Not with hatred, she'd have found that easier. With something that was almost impossibly assessment. Even now, wrists being bound, blood on his face, 60 years of empire burning below him, the part of Cassian Vespera that never stopped running numbers was looking at her and running them. "You held on," he said. She looked at him. "On the door," he said. "You could have let go." "I know," she said. "Why?" She thought about it. Not long. She was too cold and too tired and in too much pain for extended philosophy. But she thought about it. "Because letting you fall wasn't the same as choosing what happens to you," she said. "And I wanted to choose." He held her gaze for one more second. Then an agent turned him away from her and walked him toward the stairwell, and Cassian Vespera, the man who had burned her father alive, who had kept her in service in his own home for 4 years, who had run the American underworld for 3 decades, walked away across his own rooftop in the rain with his hands bound and his face composed, and the specific held stillness of a man who knew the next move was no longer his to make. Voss was speaking into his radio. Reva was giving a debrief to a second agent, her voice low and efficient. The helicopter pilot was being extracted from the cockpit by 2 more agents who had come up behind the first wave. The rooftop was filling with controlled activity, the specific organized motion of people doing the work they had been staged to do, and in the middle of it Mireia stood with her damaged shoulder and her bare feet, and the receding adrenaline leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that she could feel in her jaw. Lucien stood beside her. He was looking at the estate below, at the fire, which the first emergency vehicles were beginning to reach, red and blue lights visible through the rain along the perimeter road. He wasn't touching her, just present. In that way he'd been present all night, occupying the adjacent space without claiming it. "Dorian," she said. "Voss's people picked him up at the east perimeter 20 minutes ago." A pause. "He didn't resist either." "Men like that never do," she said. "Not at the end. The resistance is all architecture. When the architecture falls—" She stopped. Her voice had gone rougher still. She cleared her throat. "Is it done?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone buying time, just someone answering an honest question honestly. The part that ends tonight, yes, he said. The rest of it, he paused again. The rest of it takes time. She nodded. She looked at the fire below, at the building that had held her for 4 years consuming itself, and felt, not relief, not yet, something before relief, something in the space where a held breath begins to. The held breath released somewhere around 4 in the morning. That was when the last active fire suppression unit declared the Black Marrow estate structurally contained, not extinguished, because the East Wing was beyond saving and would burn through to its bones regardless, but contained, which meant the fire would consume what it was going to consume and stop there. Maria heard the radio call from where she was sitting on the rear bumper of an emergency medical vehicle at the north perimeter, a thermal blanket around her shoulders, and a paramedic working on her left shoulder with the focused economy of someone who had assessed the damage and determined it was significant but not catastrophic. Separated, the paramedic said. Partial. You'll need imaging to confirm the degree, but you've got mobility and that's good. He pressed something against the joint and she felt the pain spike and compress and settle into a lower register. You've been running on adrenaline for a while. When it goes, it's going to go hard. You need to be somewhere horizontal when that happens. I know, she said. You don't look like someone who's going to be somewhere horizontal anytime soon. I know that too. He gave her a look that said he had seen this before. People coming out of situations their bodies hadn't finished processing yet, walking around on the forward edge of a crash they were refusing to acknowledge. He taped the shoulder with professional resignation and handed her 2 ibuprofen and a water bottle and moved on to the next person who needed him. She sat on the bumper and looked at the estate. The East Wing was orange and black against the pre-dawn sky, the fire behind the remaining windows giving the building a hollowed, backlit quality, like something that had been emptied from the inside. The main structure was dark and smoke-stained, roof intact on the north and central sections, the helicopter pad visible from here with its LED perimeter lights still running on backup power, casting a pale blue glow over wet concrete. Somewhere in the building below that pad was the archive room with its steel shelving and its decades of documentation. The fire had not reached that level. Voss's agents had confirmed it an hour ago, and they were already working the room with a forensic team that had materialized with the efficiency of people who had been staged and ready for precisely this. She drank the water. Her throat was still raw from the smoke. The ibuprofen went down and she folded the foil packet and held it in her hand because she needed something to do with her hands. Riva sat down beside her on the bumper. She didn't announce herself. She came from the left and sat down in the Mirea's peripheral vision and was quiet for a moment, the way someone was quiet when they were deciding whether the other person wanted company or just needed to not be alone in it. The cut above her eyebrow had been butterfly taped. There was dried blood in her hairline that she'd missed. She was wearing a paramedic's jacket over her estate uniform, and she looked, for the first time in 3 years of working alongside this woman, like exactly what she was. Not a housekeeper, not a cover identity, just a person who was very tired and had done something very difficult for a very long time and was now on the other side of it. Voss has the testimony secured, Riva said. Cassian is in federal transport. He's not being taken to any facility with connections to the Chicago field office. Voss made that call himself, which I think means he's serious about the Croft exposure. A pause. Dorian is cooperating. Apparently he was done before they got to him. Just done. 40 years of that and he was done. Maria was quiet. The domestic staff, she said finally. The ones who are here tonight, Mrs. Caro. The kitchen workers. Accounted for. Evacuated through the south perimeter early in the breach. Voss's people have their contact information. Riva's voice was careful. They're not implicated in anything. They'll be interviewed and released. Maria nodded. She thought about Mrs. Caro pinning her into Daniela Vespera's gown with efficient hands and the specific face of a woman who had learned to do what was required without asking questions. She thought about the kitchen staff she'd eaten reheated food with at midnight, and the gardener who'd always left the good gloves out near the potting shed where she could use them even though they weren't technically for her use. People who had survived the same building by the same method she had. She was glad they were out. Daniela, she said. Hospital. She's stable. Riva glanced sideways at her. She didn't know about you, I want to be clear on that. She knew her father ran criminal operations. She knew in the way that children of powerful men know things, incompletely, selectively, in the versions they're given rather than the versions that exist. A pause. She's 21, she's going to have to build something from whatever's left. Maria understood that particular architecture. She said nothing. They sat for a moment in the ambulance light. Somewhere behind them, a federal vehicle pulled out of the staging area with its lights running but no siren, which meant it was moving something important quietly, and she thought it was probably Cassian, and found she had no particular feeling about that beyond a dry, exhausted completion. She'd thought confronting him, seeing him led away, would feel like more. It felt like the last page of a book she'd been carrying so long the cover had worn soft. "The thing you said," Riva said, "on the roof. About the cage." Maria looked at her. Riva's face was forward, looking at the estate. "You were right. I want you to know I know you were right." She said it flat and direct, without the softness that would have made it easier to receive and also less honest. "I told myself I was protecting you, and I genuinely was, inside the limits of what protecting you meant inside that situation. But the limits themselves were wrong, and I set them, and I chose to stay inside them for 3 years. A pause. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm telling you I know what it was." Maria was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the specific texture of loneliness in that house, which had been constant and which she'd managed by treating it as weather rather than deprivation. She thought about the times Riva had sat across from her in the staff kitchen at midnight and talked about nothing in particular, and whether that had been cover maintenance or something more complicated than that, and whether the difference mattered if the function was the same. "I don't know yet what I think about it," she said finally. "That's honest." "That's fair," Riva said. "I know you reported that I wasn't a threat when you could have reported otherwise. I know what that cost you in credibility with Cassian and what the risk was if he'd found out you were underreporting." She looked down at the foil packet in her hand. "I'm not going to pretend that's nothing." "It's not nothing," Riva agreed. "It's also not everything." "No," Mireya said. "It's not." They sat. The fire crackled distantly behind the estate's walls. A generator somewhere kicked on, adding its drone to the ambient noise of the scene. The sky above the tree line was beginning to differentiate, the absolute black of deep night softening towards something almost blue at the eastern horizon, the particular hour when the darkness stopped being total and started being provisional. "What happens to you now?" Mireya said. "Witness protection, initially. 6 months, maybe a year, until Cassian's trial is past the point where I'm a useful target." Riva's voice was clinical about it, the tone of someone who had been planning for this exit for long enough that its proximity felt more like completion than loss. "After that, I don't know. There's a place in the Pacific Northwest I've been thinking about for a long time. Mountains, anonymity. I know how to be invisible." The ghost of something crossed her face. "I've had practice." Mireya made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Riva looked at her sideways and made the same sound back, and for a moment, just a moment, the 3 years of complicated false context fell away. And what remained was 2 women sitting on a bumper at 4 in the morning with smoke in their hair and the ruins of something large behind them, and that was true in a way that none of the rest of it had prevented. Riva stood. She adjusted the paramedic jacket. She looked down at Mireya with an expression that had something final in it, the face of a parting that both of them understood was probably permanent. "Seraphine," she said. Mireya looked up. "It suits you better," Riva said. "Than the other one." She walked back toward the federal staging area and didn't look back, and Mireya watched her go and felt something that was too tired to be grief and too real to be nothing and left it unnamed. Lucian found her 20 minutes later. He came from the direction of the command vehicle, which meant he'd been with Voss, which meant there had been a conversation she was going to need to hear the contents of eventually. He was carrying a second water bottle and a paper cup of something hot, and he held the cup out to her and she took it. Coffee, terrible, the kind that came out of a machine that had been running continuously for too many hours. She drank it. He sat beside her where Riva had been. His jacket was still on her shoulders. She'd been wearing it since the field, and she'd kept it through the medical assessment, and she was aware of that in a way that she was choosing not to examine in detail right now. Voss, she said, is running the cleanest version of tonight he can construct, Lucian said, which is fairly clean given the documentation. The Croft connection is being escalated above the Chicago field office directly. Voss called his counterpart in D.C. from the command vehicle an hour ago, and I was present for that call. He paused. Croft will be in federal custody by this time tomorrow. She nodded. The ledger authenticates everything in the uploaded archive, he continued. Chain of custody is clean. It was in your possession from the point of recovery, transferred to Voss with witnesses, processed by federal forensics on site. Cassian's legal team will challenge it, and they will lose, because the corroborating documentation is too extensive and too internally consistent to be challenged on authentication grounds. Another pause. It's going to take 2 years minimum. The trial, the secondary prosecutions, the institutional cleanup. It won't be fast. I know. But it will happen. She looked at him. He was looking at the estate, at the contained burn of it, with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the controlled assessment of the Gala, not the operational steadiness of the tunnel and the stairwell. Something quieter. Something that had been working for a long time and had arrived somewhere it had been trying to reach. The thing you said in the field, she said, when I asked what you felt when you found out I was alive. He looked at her. Relief, she said. You said relief. Yes. I want to know what that meant. She held his gaze. Not the operational version, not the case strategy version, the actual version. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She'd learned to distinguish his silences, which was strange given the brevity of their actual acquaintance, but the night had compressed time in the way that high-stakes situations always did. His silence was the kind that came before something honest. I was 18 when you found me, he said. I'd been taken by a rival faction 3 days before. They were going to execute me in a warehouse on the south side as a message to the organization I'd been recruited into. He said it the way he said most things. Steady, factual, without the performance of emotion, but without suppressing it either. A child came through the drainage access, small, dark-haired, moving like she knew the building better than the people who used it. A pause. She looked at me. At a bound, half-conscious 18-year-old she had no reason to help. And she said, very clearly, come on. Mireia felt the words land somewhere deep. I followed a child through a drainage tunnel to stay alive, he said, and then she was gone. And I spent the next 15 years building something large enough and strong enough to find her again, and I told myself it was about the case and the ledger and the institutional destruction of Cassian Vespera. He stopped. He looked at her with his face in the pre-dawn light doing something that cost him something to allow. It was also about making sure the person who saved my life was still alive to know that it mattered. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. The thermal blanket was around her shoulders. Her feet were still bare and cold, and she didn't care. I don't remember it, she said. I've told you that. I don't have the memory. I know. So whatever debt you think, it's not a debt, he said. I'm not here because I owe you something. I'm here because I spent 15 years looking for you, and I found you, and the case is closed, and I still don't want to leave. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. Without decoration, without hedging. That's the actual version. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire behind the estate had dropped in intensity, the orange light lower and more settled, the character of it shifting from active burn to deep ember. The sky to the east was definitely blue now, a thin, cold line of it above the tree line that would widen into morning in another hour. She was 23 years old. She had spent 15 years being someone without a past, and one night becoming someone with too much of one. She had a separated shoulder and smoke damage in her lungs and feet that were going to feel the gravel and wet grass of the last several hours for days. And somewhere in a federal transport vehicle, the man who had shaped her entire life without her knowledge was on his way to the first of what would be many rooms designed specifically to contain what he was. She thought about what it meant to be a person who survived. Not escaped, survived, which was different, which was the work of actually continuing rather than just not dying. She thought about group homes and locked east wings and the specific sustainable art of making yourself invisible in rooms where visibility was dangerous. She thought about her father's handwriting in columns of numbers and what it cost a person to spend their life building something they knew they might not live to see used. She thought about a child in a burning building who had looked at a bound, half-conscious stranger and said very clearly, "Come on." "I need time," she said. "I know," he said. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to find out who I am when I'm not surviving something." She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. "I've never done that. I don't know what it looks like. I need to find out before I make any decisions about anything." "That's not a no," he said. "It's not a no," she confirmed. He nodded. He looked back at the estate. She looked back at the estate. They sat beside each other on the bumper of the emergency vehicle as the sky continued its slow revision from black to blue, and neither of them said anything else. And that was all right. The formal processing took most of the following day. She gave her statement to 3 separate federal agents in a mobile interview room that smelled of new plastic and recycled air, and she gave it completely and without omission, starting from the moment Mrs. Caro had handed her a gown and going through every room, every conversation, every detail she could access, and the agents recorded it and asked their questions in the flat professional way of people doing a job they were good at. And she answered with the same flatness, and they were done by mid-afternoon. Voss came in at the end. He stood across the small table from her in the interview room, and he had the ledger and a clear evidence sleeve in his hands, and he held it in a way that was almost involuntarily careful, and she understood that whatever his complications and his complicit silences and his managed exposures, the document he was holding represented the work that had ended his colleague's life, and he knew it, and it sat in him the way those things sat in people. "I want to say something," he said. "All right." The Hal Court investigation. He set the ledger down on the table. "I was a field agent in 2009. I wasn't the one who closed it, and I wasn't in the room when the decision was made. But I knew the finding was wrong, and I built a career on a case that should have been built on accountability for that instead." He looked at her. "I don't know if that distinction matters to you." She thought about it, genuinely considered it, the way she tried to genuinely consider things rather than responding from the first available reaction. "It matters some," she said, "not as much as what you do with the next 2 years." He held her gaze and nodded once. That was all. It was enough. The housing situation resolved through channels she hadn't expected. One of Voss's agents, a woman named Dara, young, efficient, the kind of person who solved problems before they fully formed, arranged a temporary federal safe house for the duration of the initial trial proceedings, which was a small apartment in a city she'd never been to and preferred not to name, with a view of a parking structure and a fully stocked kitchen and more silence than she'd had in years. She stayed there for 6 weeks. She learned, in those 6 weeks, several things about herself that she hadn't known. She learned that she could sleep past 5:30 in the morning, which had been impossible in the estate because the domestic schedule started at 6, and her body had adapted to wake before it regardless. She learned that she had preferences about food that had been suppressed by years of eating what was available, that she liked eggs cooked a specific way, and that she hated the taste of cilantro, and that she could spend an unreasonable amount of time making coffee carefully, and that this was, in some way she was still working out, important. She learned that silence, when it was chosen rather than enforced, felt entirely different. She learned that grief, when you finally stopped running fast enough for it to catch you, was not a single thing but a set of rooms you moved through in a non-linear order with no map and no schedule, and no way to compress the timeline regardless of what you needed from yourself. She called Lucienne twice during those 6 weeks. Both calls were brief, practical questions, case updates, the kind of conversation that could have been an email but wasn't, for reasons neither of them explicitly examined. On the second call, he asked if she was eating. She said yes. He said good. There was a pause, and in the pause she could hear the particular quality of his silence, the one she'd identified as something sitting behind the steadiness, waiting. And she said she'd call again next week, and he said all right, and they hung up. And she sat in the quiet apartment with the parking structure view and the careful coffee and felt the shape of something that was not yet ready to be named but was definitely present. a low warmth that lived below the grief and the exhaustion and the weeks of decompression, patient and persistent the way certain things were patient. The trial proceedings began in the 3rd month. She testified for 2 days. She wore a dark suit that Dara had helped her find, and flat shoes because she was done with heels, possibly permanently. And she sat in the witness chair and spoke clearly into the microphone and answered the questions asked, and did not embellish and did not collapse, and did not look at Cassie and Vespera's legal team with the contempt she felt, because contempt was for people who had time for it, and she was busy doing something more important. Cassian sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit and looked older than he had on the rooftop. Not diminished. She was careful about that distinction, careful not to need him to look destroyed, because that need would have been about her, and this was about something larger. He looked like what he was, a man at the end of a very long architecture, in the room where the structure finally ran out of walls. He didn't look at her during her testimony. On the 2nd day, at the end of cross-examination, she looked up from the microphone and found him looking directly at her, and she held his gaze across the courtroom, across the years, across the archive room, and the burning estate, and the helicopter door. And she felt none of the things she'd expected to feel. Not triumph, not closure in the clean sense that the word suggested. Something quieter. Something that acknowledged the weight of what they were to each other. The terrible, specific weight of a history built entirely without her knowledge or consent, and simply held it, because some things couldn't be resolved or released, only witnessed and carried differently. She looked away first. She was done. 8 months after the night of the Sovereign Gala, she found the vineyard. It wasn't something she'd been looking for specifically. She'd been driving up the coastal route on a Tuesday in early autumn with no particular destination, which was still a new enough experience that she hadn't worked out how to do it without feeling faintly irresponsible. The turn was unmarked on the main road. She almost missed it. She took it anyway because she'd been learning to take the unmarked turns. The property was 3 acres of dormant vines on a hillside above the Pacific, with a small house that had been empty for 2 years and a landlord in the nearest town who looked at her, a young woman with a careful face and a repaired shoulder and very good questions about structural integrity, with the cautious appraisal of someone who had learned to read people across a lifetime of small transactions. She signed the lease for 12 months. She moved in with 2 bags and a box of kitchen supplies in her father's ledger, the original, returned to her after the prosecution's documentation phase was complete, which she had not expected and which had undone her briefly, quietly, in the parking lot of the federal building where they'd handed it over. She'd sat in a rented car with the waterproof sleeve in her lap and felt the weight of it and understood that what her father had left her was not an inheritance in any ordinary sense but a truth, and that truths were heavy and also, sometimes, the only thing worth being left. She kept it on the shelf above the kitchen window. She began slowly to learn the vines. The work was nothing like what she'd done before, and also, in certain fundamental ways, exactly like it. The close attention to a living thing, the knowledge of its specific needs, the daily management of a system that didn't care about your history or your intentions, only about the quality of your attention. She was bad at it for a long time. She asked questions of people who knew more than she did and accepted answers without defensiveness and made mistakes and corrected them and made different ones. She called Lucien on a Thursday evening in November, 6 weeks after moving in, and this time when the call started, she didn't have a practical question or a case update to offer. "I found a place," she said. "Tell me about it." She told him about the 3 acres and the dormant vines and the Pacific visible from the upper hillside on clear days, about the kitchen and the coffee she was still learning to make, and the landlord in town, and the way the fog came off the water in the morning and lay in the low places between the vines, about the ledger on the shelf above the window. He listened. He didn't speak much. He had always been better at listening than most people understood, which she'd worked out somewhere in the tunnel under Black Marrow Estate, and confirmed across months of brief calls. "I'm not asking you to come," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you where I am because I want you to know." "I know the difference," he said, "and I want you to know—" She stopped, started again. "I know what you did, and I know why you did it, and I've spent 8 months working out what I actually think about it, as opposed to what I was entitled to think about it in the immediate context of that night." She looked out the kitchen window at the vines in the low evening light. You built something around me that I didn't consent to, and I'm not going to tell you that was acceptable. But you also spent 15 years trying to find a person you thought deserved to know who she was and to live that way. And you burned down the man who stole that from her, and you did it in a way that actually held. She breathed. I have both of those things in me, and they are both true. He was quiet for a moment. That's honest, he said. I'm learning to be, she said. It's harder than it sounds. I know. Give me 3 more months, she said, and then come if you want to. We'll figure out what we figure out. A pause. Not long. I'll come in February, he said. February, she agreed. She hung up and stood at the kitchen window with her hands on the sill and looked at the vines going dark in the late light. The Pacific a silver smear at the horizon where the fog was beginning to roll in off the water, and she breathed, and her shoulder ached in the way that repaired things ached in cold weather, and the ledger was on the shelf behind her. And outside the fog was moving through the low places between the vines in long white scarves, soft and lateral, carrying the smell of salt and distance and the specific cool damp of a coastal evening in November in a place no one had told her to be. She was there because she'd chosen it. She was Seraphine Arden because she'd said the name aloud and kept saying it, in hospital rooms and courtrooms and federal offices, and to the landlord in town who wrote it on the lease without comment, until it had stopped feeling like a reclamation and started feeling like a fact. She was 23 years old, and she had burned down an empire and survived a father's legacy, and walked barefoot through a burning building and held a man over a rooftop. Not because she was fearless, but because fear was a thing you moved through rather than a wall you stopped at. And she had learned that at 8 years old in a drainage tunnel with someone else's fire at her back. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched the fog move in across the vines. She let the silence be what it was. Chosen, owned, hers. Beyond the window, the Pacific worked its patient, enormous business with the cliffs below. And the ghosts that had followed her for 15 years felt, for the first time, like they were moving at a different pace than she was. Not gone. Not resolved in the clean sense. Just falling behind slowly, the way things fell behind when you finally started walking forward fast enough. She drank the coffee. It was good.